Today's topic is designing as a user, and it's definitely the second part of my last lecture on the self-managed studio. And at the very end, I provoked you to think about your role in self-management. You could not come to self-management as a boss, neither you could come to self-management as the expert designer that would design for others. And in this presentation, I'm going to share some insights that I got from my own experience of joining self-management collectives beyond the self-managed studio as a user. And you can also design as a user and fade a little bit or avoid a little bit being this role of the designer, the one who knows how to design things in relation to others who don't know how to design things. But before we get into that specific content, I want first to remember and connect back to other streams of thoughts that are very gaining currency in design research. The concept of positionality is pretty related to that. When we say positionality, we are drawing from feminist cultural studies, and in those writings, the authors, they say, if you're going to do qualitative research, how can we evaluate that your bias is not somehow contaminating or distorting your data? One way how you can approach this is to disclose your bias through the concept of positionality. So basically, positionality is a resource that researchers have to disclose and reflect about their social historical positions of their human body, including ancestry, gender, race, class, ethnicity, body condition, and handedness. I'm going to talk about handedness later because this is typically neglected in the discussions of positionality in both social sciences, but mostly importantly in design research, where creates a kind of a gap that does not let us see ourselves as users, and thinking that user is in itself a positionality. The person who is most prominently bringing forth this concept in design research is Leslie Ann Noel. Dr. Noel has been very vocal about the importance of knowing yourself while you design for other people and when you design with other people. So she started developing this canvas or tool to discuss and analyze and compare different positionalities. It's called the positionality wheel. You can print it out and work on a sheet of paper with even Lego pieces on top like we typically do here. But she devised it during the pandemic times, and she used for online Miro-based co-design workshops. And as you can see here in the example, you basically answer the questions here that will give you shared positionality. So if people are answering the same way, you will see that they have same positionalities. If they're answering differently, they have different positionalities. Questions range from what's your gender or sexual orientation, what's your age, where did you grow up, and it can be customized to each situation, which kind of positions you want to discuss and share and compare. Leslie Ann Noel is also explaining approach in this book, Design Social Change, that's being out last year by the Stanford D School Guide series. It's a book that I recommend really to you because it's a very short introduction, an overall view of the things we do here. She's also a scholar that builds upon the work of Paulo Freire and bell hooks and other critical pedagogy authors. In that book, she also somehow proposed a new concept that goes next to positionality. Yeah, sure. It's called oppositionality. So Leslie Ann Noel is also emphasizing that once we realize our position in the world and our relationship with others, we will ultimately or inevitably realize that we are against something that damages or that threatens or that puts into question one of these positions. For example, you could be, if you are a black person, you are in that positionality, you're supposed to be against racism. And that's your oppositionality. Sometimes it happens that people don't have the expected oppositionality from their positionalities. Like, for example, a black person who's not opposed to racism, who's actually racist. These things happen as much as it happens in other groups, like sexist women, like a ableist person with disabilities, like indigenous person, because these people are typically confused about their positionalities. They are not so sure who they are. In any case, Leslie Ann Noel is trying to help us to figure out and reflect about this so we don't end up in this counterproductive positionalities. In a productive positionality, you know what are you against that, right? So it's the explicit reading of the world from an oppressed positionality, or positioning the self against an oppressive feature of the world that must change. So basically, Design Social Change is a book about designing things that are oppressive in the world. I also have other ways of dealing with positionality, different than Leslie Ann Noel. For example, last year we made a self-portrait using trash, and that was also a way of discussing positionality. But I also have tools for discussing oppositionality. And one of them I draw directly from the Theater of the Oppressed arsenal. It's called What Am I? What Do I Want? It's a dramatic game where people are supposed to say out loud, what am I and what I want? And I added up the third question, what does not let you become or be or whatever do? And you basically write down the answers to those questions in a post-it, and you attach to the body, to your body, in a place where it makes more sense, where that question is heavier on your body. For example, this person answers the question, what I am, by putting the post-it on his forehead, because he's probably having a brainy profession. So I'm like the computer programmer on the room, has to fix everything with the mind. But he has pain, he's also suffering things. I don't recall exactly what were written in those post-its, but what I mean is that once you start to look at each other and see what they are against, you can also see what they are in favor, because there's always a positionality implied into a no positionality, and vice versa. That's why it's good to be aware of both things. And if you are aware of positionality and oppositionality, you are developing what Paulo Freire, Álvaro Vieira Pinto, and Leslie Ann Noel call critical consciousness. Knowing yourself, what to oppose, and acting according to your best interests. It sounds really great. It sounds reasonable. It sounds fair. But unfortunately, we live in a society that cultivates a lot of naive consciousness. That's a concept developed by Álvaro Vieira Pinto. It's less known concept than critical consciousness. A lot of people know what critical consciousness is, but they know very little about what is the opposite of critical consciousness, which is naive consciousness. And he has an entire 700 pages book about this. It's a very detailed analysis of how naive consciousness manifested in Brazilian society in the 1960s. In the 2022 year, I run a course on this book in Brazil, and together with my students, we analyzed how many of the characteristics of naive consciousness of Brazil of the 1960s were still present and very much alive during Brazil's times of 2022. And many of those people manifesting those naive consciousness were indeed identifying themselves with this far-right movement that would try to keep their hold of the country, but they couldn't, because Bolsonaro, the far-right candidate, lost the election in that same year. So, but it was interesting to understand why they supporting, why are ex-far right voters, or why are naive voters, to put it that way, supporting Bolsonaro. That is a good answer, the way how Vieira Pinto explains it. I cannot go through the details of that now, but you should just know that this relates directly to discussions we were having last week. I was explaining you that hetero management has these interfaces blocking out or creating a buffer zone between managers and workers, so that managers can control workers and workers believe that they need to be controlled, and designers and users are ambiguous positionalities in this process. Sometimes designers are identified with managers and they control users as much as they control workers, or even the tried workers feel like they are users. Other possibilities, designers can also identify with workers and actually help to empower users. But if they do so, this diagram will become completely different, and then designers will become actually users. But we'll get to that point later on. So just to remind you, the words we were using last week, hetero management, and connecting what you saw here today. Hetero management nurtures naive consciousness, of course, because that helps to keep the unequal structure as intact. If people are not critical, they don't want to change things. And extending naive consciousness to design, or when designers are naive, they don't realize they are workers as much as they don't realize they are users. Just two examples of how does this affect designers' life. In the last 4 years, designers, especially in the United States, working in the tech sector, they experienced a boom. And there were just 600% more jobs opening in UX research. And UX design, there were 265% more new jobs. However, since 2023, there are less jobs available than there were before. Or in other words, job opportunities are being eliminated. They also call it layoff. Basically, people are being kicked out of their jobs because the industry doesn't need as many UX designers they are now available. So the current ratio is 77%. So 30% of the UX designers of the past are now unemployed. That's not the same for UX researchers. As you can see here, the demand is still higher than what was before. So it is still a growing profession. And by the way, here's a tip. If you want to go to industry, MXD research program helps you to become more like a UX researcher than a UX designer. And you also get better salaries. So if you want to study this topic on your own, go for it. But we are not going to approach that directly because we are doing something more substantial than UX research here, which is probably more interesting for the general public than just supporting capitalist companies to keep this exploitation process in place. However, most of the techniques we use here are also used by UX researchers for capitalist industries. So here's, just to wrap up this thing, many UX designers, UX researchers, they think that they are not even workers. They think they are becoming strategic. They're having a seat at the table. They are becoming leaders. But as soon as companies don't need, they are fired. And that's to remind them that they are not owners. They are not capitalists. And on the other side, much less known and realized, is the condition of being a user. And here's what can happen to you if you are a user in another country besides the United States, and the United States ends up having a trade war with your country. Your digital services, your design tools may be jeopardized. That's what happened to Venezuelans designers in 2019.
Was the same in Russia?
Also in Russia.
Let's say pirate.
Yeah, okay, but the problem is that many people had those files online in the Adobe Creative Suite cloud, and they didn't know that beforehand. So it was really, all of a sudden, all of these services are shut down for these users, and they lose the files that are there.
That's upsetting. That happened to me before, but not in this context. Like when you save there, you don't have control if the app fails or if they just decide to, like you said, shut it down. So I can only imagine how upsetting that must have been.
Yes. Okay, so here's the thing. Designers, when they don't think that they are users, they don't think about backing up their files. They don't think about something going wrong with their tools, and not even to think about using free software, something that they would be always, that will be always available to them. Because they believe that they are part of this creative, fantastic class. They're gonna transform the world for the better. They are part of this big wave of good energy, but it's not true. It's all capitalism just fantasized, just deceiving people, right? We should be clear that we are workers and we are users. And once you start to realize that you need to design as, and not just design for or design with, then you get this positionality as a driver of your design work. For example, black designers organize themselves and they produce this marvelous book, The Blacks Experiencing Design, Identity, Expression, and Reflection. But also women, they had this woman-made great women designers book. Queer people, they have this queer versus design, 50 years of signs, symbols, banners, logos, graphic art of LGBTQ people. There is also the national identity, positionalities. The Brazilians are well represented by this book, Brazilian Modern Design by Maria Cecilia Loscavo dos Santos. And there is this very recent book, Feminist Designer, on the person and the political in design, which brings up some kind of a specific identity that even a man can become a feminist designer if you abide to those principles and you're part of the social movement. There are many other new growing or emerging identities to design as someone, as some part of some group. But it's hard because those identities, they often overlap. And it's not, you're not just a queer person, you're also a queer woman or a queer man or a queer trans or a queer non-binary person. That's all creates more complexity. And then you add up to class, race, and handiness, then you have a hard time to figure out what is the identity that prevails that will provide me drive to fight what I'm against. And what am I against again? Sometimes people forget one of those.
What is handiness? Or like?
I'm gonna get to there in a minute. Handiness is actually a particular contribution that reading the work of Álvaro Vieira Pinto brings to our design. Together with Rodrigo Gonzato, Brazilian researcher that I collaborate and wrote many papers with, including the paper you discussed today on designing money. We are unearthing this and translating this concept from Vieira Pinto's book. In that book, he describes handiness as a relationship between what is available around my body, in my world, for me to use, and the historical work involving in making that available. So nothing is gratuitous there. Nothing is for free. Nothing is God's gift. There was someone working to put that into place around you. And if your relationship with that work is one of alienation, like you don't know, you are not aware that people are working, then you will have a lower handedness. You don't know how to use things because they have been designed, they have been worked out by someone in another world, and you are not even aware under which conditions are this. So considering handedness in this discussion of oppositionality and positionality means designing as workers and as users. So a lot of people, when they write books and they explore identity power design, they forget about or being a worker and being a user. Because unfortunately we live in a very capitalist society, and class is often neglected in the discussion. Because capitalism profits from keeping to place class as a fundamental oppression system, where the others are managed, and sometimes you have more liberal approach towards sexuality. For example, United States before Trump returned to power, and now all of a sudden the gay rights, the trans rights are under jeopardy because capitalism sometimes changes its rules, and this does not seem maybe so profitable enough. But still, in both cases, capitalism was making profit because you can sell products, services customized to queer people, not just books like I just showed to you. So if we want to really fight oppression systems, this is the diagram. We need to engage as users working with other users and as workers working with other workers, designing interfaces collaboratively. And I already gave you this example, I'm just reminding you, but self-management is a tradition from the workers' movement, and it has been explored in many different parts of the world. I'm just showing here Yugoslavia because they were probably at the forefront of the socialist self-management during the 70s. But we also do self-management in our design studios, as I explained last week. And in that kind of studio, we do self-conscious design, when designers design interfaces as designers by themselves, for themselves, like the crisis card deck. It's designers understanding what it is to be a designer. But what does designing as a user, right? Designing done by users for users looks like? That's my question today. And in the first overview, I provide these examples of users' design, so designed by users, and they look quite crude on the first view. You might think, wow, this is not design, this is just fix, this is just a kludge. You may have in your own language different terms for that. In Brazil, we use gambiarra. I know that in Colombia they call it malicia indígena or indígena. In Mexico they call it rasquache. In India they call it jugad. Do you recall yourself any name now that will be suitable to describe this kind of improvisational fix? Jokap? In Bahamian.
Yeah. It's just like you just mess with things in a way, like I don't know what the sound movement is either, but it's just like when you just that.
You see, you know that this difficulty of putting into words is because it's tacit knowledge. It's very little articulated.
Isn't it handiness?
Handiness is like the relationship that these people have with their world. It's like the category, but you can also have a developed handiness or something that looks like modern, which is still handiness. This is like underdeveloped handiness or low tech, as Hien likes to call it, or user designs. Do you call yourself any other name for it in your culture? Huh? How's that like in Iran?
It's like trash.
It's like trash. Oh no. I expected you having a more empowering term for it. Here's the thing. This is the best design out there, at least on my perspective. You know why? Because first of all, it's reusing resources that have been already extracted from the environment. So this is typically recycling or upcycling, meaning there's a lower impact on the environment if you reuse. These materials could end up being in a landfill, or they could have been thrown on the rivers and up in the ocean, polluting the environment in so many ways and coming back to us through food. And instead of that, two things have been saved. The material doesn't go to the landfill, and people don't buy a new one. They don't purchase, they don't require new extractions. So I think you save twice if you do use a design like this. And that's another thing. It's also not protected by intellectual rights. So anyone can copy these solutions. And they typically spread. You just see it, and then you copy, and you transform, you maybe improve it. But it's very open source. Even before open source concept was invented, people were doing this already. There's more to say about this. I'm not focusing on these examples, but there's definitely a contrast. If you look at this and you think about, this is the best design, what to do with the modern design, yeah, this is against it. This design is opposed to modern design. It is basically saying, we don't care about modern design. We don't want to be modern design. We don't want to make something that looks modern because we believe that sometimes that's maybe too expensive, inaccessible, less authentic, and it doesn't have any touch with the local culture. It doesn't express the local values. So basically, designing as user means opposing modern design and its definition of humanity, which is something more substantial. If you consider what is behind every modern design, there's a view of a white male able body that has been expressed visually by many artists. Probably the most famous one is the Vitruvian Man of Leonardo da Vinci. And it's not so much about this particular picture, but what it means, right? That the standard, the default designer, creator, but also user is this white male body.
I still don't know what that means.
I don't know what it means, but I know he's like a
I mean, I
phenomenal
know that
artist
he's
because I learned about his work, but yeah.
The main thing is perfection, the proportions of the body. Yeah, the proportion of the body is perfect because it can fit not just a square, but also a circle. But there's more to it. This is just like the geometric meaning, but there's definitely a more sociological meaning. What does it mean is that the white male body is the perfect body and female body are less perfect. That's just to start with, right? If we're going to get all of those positionalities, this is the one that matters and the rest is just crap. And you can advance 500 years and you would still see this overvaluation of the white male body behind design, modern design. Here's Nicolas Negroponte. He was the director of MIT Media Lab for a while. At this picture, he's being an entrepreneur, the founder of the One Laptop Per Child startup that tried to bring laptops for $100 or even less for children in underdeveloped countries like Brazil. And as you can see, the difference between the Renaissance and modern times is that in the past, the white male body was shown alone. And now there is a contrast. The white body is shown in contrast with people of color body, non-white bodies, or black bodies, and brown bodies. So you basically see this person telling, look, we are great, we are superior, but we do also have, we also feel guilty for being that superior. So we want to share some of our privileges by bringing those laptops for a cheaper price to these people. Please invest in our company and we can reduce white guilt or white man burden. This project was unsuccessful in part because of this, like very racist, and they basically, MIT at this moment and all the PC project, they basically had this they didn't want to engage the dialogue. They just wanted to throw those laptops into these communities. In fact, they had a plan to throw really boxes on villages in Africa. So they would not even explain, they would just throw the laptops and go away. Pretty much inspired by this controversial movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy, is that?
Yeah.
Gods Must Be Crazy? Where someone throws a Coke bottle and everything changes in a certain village in Africa. So they thought that a laptop would also change everything there and would help Africa come out of what they call the state of underdevelopment. Nowadays, the current criticism of Africa is that Africa is not capitalist enough. It is on the cover of the Business Week, New Economist, I don't remember. One of the major magazines of economy, they are complaining about Africa's lack of capitalism. That's the problem. Well, they forget to tell the rest of the message that the problem with Africa is the centuries of colonialism, right? They are still recovering from it. And some countries that still have strong attachment to the metropolises, but that's part, The Economist or Business Week, I don't remember which one was it. They forget. But because they believe that they are superior, they know what black bodies should do because they are the white bodies, they carry the burden. So you can see that this is behind modernist design, and designing as a user comes from a project of countering this. And in my own trajectory, this started in 2007 when I founded, together with other colleagues, like-minded, the Faber-Ludens Interaction Design Institute, and we departed from a different idea of what humanity could be. The word Faber-Ludens is opposing to Homo sapiens. It's a new kind of human being that plays out while making things and producing a world in an imaginative way, instead of just using rationality behind this concept of categorizations that you saw before. And you also have women sharing her creation, how robotic, I don't remember. What was it about? Something about expanding the senses. Don't remember what was this addition to our body. So this cybernetic body, like being a cyborg, was already part of the discussion of what is to be a human being at that time. And we had a website, and we shared every project we did online freely, so everyone could read what we were designing, because we understood that this was important to trailblaze the field and let more people be part of it. And at some point, we had so many different other online services connected to that website. We called it a media ecology or a mashup. And some of them were open source software like Moodle. Moodle does similar what Canvas does here at the University of Florida, but it's an open source software many universities across the world uses, including my past one. But we also had YouTube and Ustream and so many other things going on. A lot of people engaged in these different channels. And that was the first moment we realized that we could not design one single thing. We had to design things in relationship as it was part of an ecology. At that time, we didn't have any programmer in our staff. We had to design based on open source software that we could program using visual languages on a simple level. And that's how we actually started to realize we were users. We were designing as users of those basic platforms we are combining. And coming back to design and contrasting what was being discussed in the design industry at that time, we realized that Apple was growing and drawing a lot of attention at that time. Everybody was telling that Apple had the best design out there. But Apple had the most secret design process. Nobody knew how did they design things. So they basically had this beautiful black box that you could not know what was inside and how things were made. We didn't want to follow that path. That's why we started to look more critically about design thinking. This approach started by D School in Stanford, and in part to share what the founders of D School have developed for many years at IDEO. Their company had one major office next to Stanford, so they worked really close to each other. And they started to develop many different kind of materials to share their design process in opposition to what Apple did, but also still having strong commercial interests and even having more colonialist or more explicit colonialist approach than even Apple. Like most of the open IDEO initiatives and the human-centered design toolkit materials, they were targeting underdeveloped countries or third world nations at that time. And we were looking at this in Brazil and we were thinking we don't want to do that, but we still want to do something similar. We want to combine and draw things from Apple, but draw from IDEO, but do something that will be more reasonable and sensible to Brazil. We are also observing the rise of the concept of open design, mostly in Europe and later on in the United States. The Fab Labs, the places where you could build anything and share your source code and see people developing further your projects. So basically what we did at Fabeluden is we ate open design through anthropophagy, which is a cultural appropriation strategy that indigenous people started in Brazil, and later on some artists built on top during the modernist movement at the beginning of the 20th century, and later on the Tropicalia movement during the military dictatorship, and much closer to us in the 2000s in the digital culture movement, pioneered by Gilberto Gil, a famous Brazilian musician who was also a politician and a pioneer of using Creative Commons for the arts. We basically drew from many of these sources to design Livre, which was our design approach. In that approach, we basically have transparent boxes that you can look inside and you can meet other people because it's a collaborative open source project with participatory channels. So you could basically join. And once we got this idea behind Design Livre, once we got all of this ideology in place, we wanted to have a platform that would support this. Everything we were doing in different platforms at Fabeludens, you remember that media ecology, we tried to make more integrated into one thing, which became Corai's platform. So it was created in 2011 as an alternative to OpenIDEO. So whenever you say you like design thinking, whenever you bring those double diamond models to me and you get excited, remember that since 2011 at least, I'm fighting this thing. Because it's very colonialist. Or if you're going to share to me, the first thing I'm going to do is help you figure out the colonialist bias of this tool. But coming back to Corai's platform, it was developed with Drupal 6.0 and several other open source software. They have been mashed up. I think it was more than 200 different open source software combined together in that platform. We had this radical transparency policy. All project contents were and still are accessible via the web without a login. So you can check this many projects there and see what they were doing 10 years ago. And because everything is also mandatorily shared using Creative Commons licenses. So here's how one project looks like. So you see actually the design of a card deck. So we are brainstorming the text that will be included in that card deck. Here are other collaborative tools. Each one of them is an open source software integrated into the same environment. And I designed all of this, I developed all of this based on visual programming or high level, high abstract programming. I didn't know how to program very well, but I made this very complex platform. And you can also do that. It's not so difficult as it looks like, just because this very generous open source programmer community share this freely. And there's a lot of people like me, activists, using open source software in their initiatives. At some point, we were superseding Google Drive. We were better than Google Drive. Can you imagine this? We could not cope with that for too many years, but we were doing better than them. And going beyond Fabeludens' website, we also had connections to physical spaces. We envisioned Corais being a platform that would connect Fab Labs, studios, and we would have this signature method cards, which became known as UX cards. And after we designed using the platform, these cards, and they later on tried out in some organizations we work with, we integrated the cards on the website, or better put it that way, in the platform. Corais platform has virtual cards, and you can play out them similarly as you would do in a table. We also use the platform to design and write a book about the design livre ideology, and this writing took place across one entire week. We used collaborative writing when Google Drive wasn't that good enough, not quick enough as we were in need. We also used virtual conferencing. All of those technologies were experimental at those times. So designing in a hybrid mode like we did was pretty pioneering, 2012. And this is the book that came out of that, Design Livre. It is translated into Spanish, not yet available in English. As we use it more and more, we shift from designing Corais for others to designing for ourselves. And by 2014, we came to the conclusion that the open innovation strategy of Fabeludens didn't work for many reasons. The capitalism versus socialist ideologies debate inside Fabeludens led it to its end. Basically, the capitalists and the socialists that were working democratically in the past, they could no longer agree, so we decided to close Fabeludens. But Corais went forward. Corais outlived Fabeludens, and a lot of collaborative culture producers, people associated with that Brazilian digital culture movement that Gilberto Gil sparked back in the beginning of 2000s, they were really excited about using Corais for their purposes. So they basically wanted to organize popular culture or folk culture initiatives using digital technologies and explore their possibilities on using free software. They wanted a national platform rooted in Brazilian culture that they could contact their owners, their developers, and keep capital in their own country. They wanted to have self-management interfaces because they want to self-manage themselves, and they wanted to have everything Creative Commons with a lot of data transparency. And he's one of the first digital culture movement projects, Movimento Conchativa. They are basically managing one big concert hall of this university that the university wasn't using, so they handled to the cultural producers, activists, and they started to organize events, offer courses, and basically make that community around the place alive. And after installing a chat tool in a chat feature in this platform in 2012, I got in touch with one of the biggest or most active entrepreneurs in that group, who is called Pedro Jatobá. And Pedro was part of several self-managed collectives wanting to experiment with digitally mediated solidarity economy in cultural production. So basically they wanted to print their own money, to design their own money, and they didn't know how to do this using digital technologies. They came to Corais thinking that this was probably the closest to what they wanted. They were inspired by workers' movement in Brazil who use solidarity economy for now many decades. Mostly, it's worth mentioning the landless workers' movement as one of the biggest spreaders of solidarity economy in Brazil. So they basically promote bartering sessions amongst food producers, but they also have local currency, so they also print money. And Jatobá proposed in our meta design project. Corais platform hosts many projects, but it also hosts its own project, So meta design is with us for many, many years. It's not just a buzzword I use every time. I really mean it. So there was a space in the platform where you could actually promote changes to the platform. And Jatoba went forward and proposed to have a digital social currency module. We developed that based on available open source software modules. So we combined them, and this is the result. So you could look at any time what was the health of that community currency. So over here you see each one of those persons were participating to that community, and they were having mostly a green balance. So they were having more money than they would own to the community. If there were many arrows pointing to negative, if the community is in debt, it's a bad sign. It means that a lot of people are taking things out of the community and not putting anything back. So it's a very interesting indicator of the health of that community. Here's the community in a physical space. The same thing you saw there before. You see here enacted by physical bodies. So they are basically fixing things up in their school, their theater school, and making sure that school runs up their courses, even if they had faced budget cuts for their activities. Here's how they implemented the bank. One person would post a need, a task to be done. For example, we need to fix this door, which is broken. Someone would fix the door and they would post it, I fixed it. A third person would go there and check, okay, it is fixed. And they would post a comment. And a fourth person would operate the bank and transfer the money from the community bank, the common good resource that Lucy was talking about before. How did you call it? Commonwealth? The Commonwealth, yes. This person would transfer the Commonwealth to the person who executed the work. And this person would have to use that money to purchase other services from that same community. Which service? Well, mostly in that case, the course itself. So if you would have to join this school, you would have to pay the school by actually executing some services to the school. So you get money that would use to pay back the school. Did you get it?
No.
Yeah, but it's kind of like you might as well just let them keep it, or 'cause
You could
it's
do
a
that.
cycle.
Yes, because it's not going anywhere, right?
Yeah.
However, the difference is that if you just say, just do this voluntarily, this service needed here, and you don't register that, people don't feel recognized. What we discovered here that was key to the sustainability of this effort, because it lasted for 3 years, is that people felt recognized by the system much better than if they were paid by money, the real money. Because there was someone looking at what they have done, at least 2 people. And it was a public space, right? So other people could also look at all the transactions going on in this bank, another aspect of this radical transparency philosophy.
I feel like that radical transparency should be happening in politics, in politicians.
Exactly.
I don't understand why we don't know how much they make.
And what they do with the money.
Some countries have better transparencies than others. I would say Brazil has a much better transparency than the United States. So you could actually...
Much less.
What?
And that is much less.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, we have less.
So for example, in Brazil, there was this very cool initiative called the Hacker Bus. And there were quite some hacker activists who got inside this bus, and they were traveling around Brazil doing workshops on data transparency, hacking governmental accounts and extracting their public information and publishing that to denounce corruption actions. And these guys, they end up working for the government to implement policies so that this would become like regular. So Brazil is doing a lot of work on trying to get rid of this this reputation of being a corrupt country. And many politicians were caught by these transparency measures, including Bolsonaro himself got caught in one of these systems because it's getting more and more available to the public scrutiny. But we wanted to make this not just a governmental thing, but it's part of the culture. If everyone is accustomed to be held accountable for the public, not just governmental people, the whole culture will enjoy being transparent. But also, on the other hand, corruption also comes from a basic feeling that you're not being recognized by your work enough, so that you have to steal, because otherwise you cannot get a profit. But if you are well recognized for your work, if you have the good career perspective, why would you become a corrupt?
I would say you realize that the structure of the economy is terrible, and you don't want your family to
Exactly.
be like that. So you just take for yourself and you disregard everyone else, which is insane, because you are the seat, or you control the way that everyone else lives, not only yourself. So, like my country, they don't tell you how anything is spent or where things go, but they just tell you, oh, we need more money. We're gonna raise this. We're gonna raise
Right.
that, and it's like people could barely buy bread. Like, what are you talking? Like, people sit on the corner and they just, can you give me some money? Can you, like, people are not as wealthy. I don't know where they think we get money from, because they don't raise the minimum wage and all of these different things, but they still take so much and don't give a lot. So to your point of like people not feeling recognized, they don't care about recognition. They just want their family to not suffer, and they want to go to the dinners and dress nice and be on TV and smile, but they're stealing from everybody.
Yeah.
Because we recently had a commissioner, he had to step down because he was mixed up in the white powder for producing it and sharing it around. You're the police, like the head police, like the top of the polices, you're the big dog, and you're selling cocaine. That's actually insane. That's like...
Yeah. But that's the thing. If we have a society where this mindset of quantity is what matters and quality is disregarded, pretty much like we experiment in the simulation games we played, people would do whatever they need to just to increase the quantity of their assets. We need to focus on quality, and quality becomes more tangible through human relationships, and when these human relationships are recognized. So this is basically a pilot of something that could definitely be done widely, right? So there are actually cities in Brazil experimenting with solidarity economy on a large basis with thousands and thousands of people as part of it, like getting a basic minimum income using those kind of local currencies and getting rid of poverty. But in our case, the backing of that currency, let's say the trust that we would build on that currency, was based on the collective capacity of that group to produce certain services in a month. So basically, everyone in that particular collective, that project, they could produce one visual identity project. They could produce one visiting business card, one folder, one poster per month. And that would cost, for someone who would like to buy, this much in their currency. But they knew that for sure they would be able to produce. Because if someone would have the money and they would order that service and their service wouldn't be delivered, the trust of that currency would go down. So that's how they build a solid economy, by just promising to produce a certain amount of goods that will be available in a certain period of time. And how do you come up with those numbers and those services? Well, they have a very detailed method to come up with this mapping of the plenty of skills and expertise that are shared. So here you see that a lot of people in this particular group know how to produce audiovisual stuff, like record, edit, video footage. That's why they could produce a lot of movies and very few, let's say, network management. But they still could produce that if they wanted. Pedro Jatobá engaged in a master of science research. During 2 years, he documented everything he learned in the colonialists platform, and this is written and published in his PhD, his master dissertation. So everything I'm just explaining here briefly is explained in very much details in his work, currently only available in Portuguese. And we also wrote a more popular, accessible book called Coralizando. Actually, not just Pedro da Tobar, but me and many other people that were using Corais at that time. We wrote this book as a kind of a manifesto sharing what we learned. That was 2014. And 10 years later, we now have 700 projects, 7,000 members spread across Brazil. The platform is now much less active because the technology is pretty outdated. There's another platform that stemmed from this one. It's called Reuse. It was designed by ETA, which is a cooperative, a co-op in information technology development that came originally from the landless workers movement, but it became independent. They designed this tool to help social movements to organize better and to share information. It's similar to Corais, but it has more a modern look, or maybe more connected to current ways of interacting with through apps and mobile phones. And I've got one of my former students working with Rios and designing their own meta design channel. And she was really interested on social movements and the way she was looking at the way how these collaborative culture producers appropriated Corais, and she's the author of the second article you read this week. So Isabela Siqueira, did this for her final work, and besides that, she was writing that paper on service design by the oppressed. And what we are now realizing is that indeed we are designing as users with other users, as your workers with other workers, those interfaces that enable us to self-manage ourselves. And designing interfaces as users means being more attentive to past, present, and future handiness. This relationship between what is available and the work involved into making that available. By joining workers in that process of liberation, in this process of learning how they could overcome capitalist exploitation through solidarity economy, for example, we also liberated ourselves from capitalist, colonialist, and patriarchal modes of design thinking like the ones spread to the undeveloped world by IDEO, by Stanford D School, by OLPC, and many other initiatives that didn't let this kind of solidarity, alternative ways of living and coexisting to come to the fore, because they were pretty much based on opposite ways of producing the world. So basically we were going against huge powers, and we thrived for so many years. I cannot say that this current situation is very hopeful for those projects I showed to you, but there's definitely other projects that people who participate in Corais or in Rios or in Fabeludens, they are now developing further. And you're part of this too, because MXT is somehow a place where these ideas, these practices are brought forward, and you can build on top of this and become yourself liberated through this process. Okay. Thank you so far.